7th of September 1940. Above the hedgerows of Kent, the evening air hung warm and metallic, the sun sliding under a haze the color of burnt sugar. Heinkel He-111 crews droned west at 3,000 meters, the engine's steady thrum stitched with the staccato tat-tat of British flak climbing to meet them. They thought they knew this dance. Timed fuses, neat arithmetic, shells that bloomed too soon or too late. Then something went wrong. A burst did not open into a distant flower. It punched close, vicious, a white-hot ring of shrapnel that seemed to find the bombers as if by intent. One pilot later wrote that his wingman's machine came apart like paper in a fist. No tracer, no fighter in sight. Only an invisible trigger in the sky. Below, QF 3.7-inch batteries hammered at 10-20 rounds a minute, their 28-pound shells arcing into a lattice the Luftwaffe had learned to thread. But now explosions arrived with uncanny timing, near enough to shear control cables and tear radiators open, near enough to feel in the teeth. Crews swore something new had entered the fight that week. British records would later show the decisive change was taking shape in laboratories, even as the Blitz began. In a cramped room thick with rosin and ozone, a young physicist, Samuel Curran, was refining a matchbox-sized trick of radio and vacuum tubes, an electronic nerve in the fuse that could sense an airplane and detonate at the perfect instant. The air, once merely a medium, was about to become a weapon with a mind. To understand how that mind was built, component by component, equation by equation, we have to leave the gun pits of Kent and step inside the lab that taught a shell to think. By July 1940, the hum of engines over Britain had become a daily reminder of survival hanging by a thread. Every dawn brought new bomber formations crossing the Channel, and every dusk ended with columns of smoke twisting above London's docks, Coventry's factories, and the Kent airfields that still smouldered from the last attack. The Royal Air Force fought valiantly. But for the men of the Anti-Aircraft Command, the ACAC gunners standing behind their 3.7-inch and 4.5-inch guns, the battle was one of faith and mathematics. Each gun could spit 20 shells a minute, yet the sky swallowed almost all of them. Timed fuses, set with stopwatch precision, were little more than guesswork. A split second too early, and the explosion bloomed uselessly in empty air. Too late, and the Heinkels and Dorniers roared home untouched. Calculations were made by slide rule and instinct, and as official figures later admitted, over 90% of shells failed to come within lethal range. The British had radar to see the bombers coming, but not the means to make the data lethal. The missing link lay not in steel or powder, but in the fuse itself. Across the Atlantic, American naval officers were fighting the same despair. On practice ranges, they watched high-speed drones slash through barrages unscathed. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance warned that even a perfect gun was useless without a fuse that could think faster than human reflexes. It was this mutual desperation that drew London and Washington into secret cooperation. In September 1940, under the Tizard mission, a small team of British scientists arrived in the United States carrying the crown jewels of wartime science, radar secrets, jet prototypes, and a concept for a new kind of fuse. Within months, British ideas and American industrial power would fuse, literally, to create a miracle of microseconds, the proximity fuse. It would not just defend Britain's skies, but alter the balance of the entire air war. In the autumn of 1939, as Europe slid into total war, a quiet revolution was taking shape in a dimly lit laboratory at the University of Glasgow. Amid the hum of transformers and the faint smell of heated solder, a young Scottish physicist named Samuel Curran stood over a cluttered workbench beside his mentor, Professor Charles Wynne Williams. Curran had been studying the strange dance of radio waves, the invisible ripples that could bounce off metal surfaces and return echoes. The concept was elegant. An oscillating circuit would send out a signal, and if a target approached, the returning wave would disturb that signal. It was, in essence, the heartbeat of radar. But what if that heartbeat could be placed inside a shell, so the shell itself could feel its target before it struck? The challenge was staggering. A shell's flight subjected it to accelerations of nearly 20,000 times the force of gravity. Any electronic component fragile enough to crack under that stress was instantly useless. Yet Curran began experimenting with miniature vacuum tubes, tiny glass valves capable of handling high-frequency oscillations. If they could be made small, rugged, and fast enough, they could detect a nearby aircraft's reflection and trigger an explosion at precisely the right distance. The idea was as audacious as it was improbable. To shrink the principles of radar, one of the largest wartime technologies, into something small enough to fit inside a fuse no bigger than a matchbox. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic at Johns Hopkins University, physicist Merle and his team at the Applied Physics Laboratory were chasing the same dream in secret. By the summer of 1941, they had achieved the impossible, a functioning radio proximity fuse. When fitted to a 5-inch anti-aircraft shell, it could sense an airplane within 70 feet and detonate without human timing. The world's first self-thinking munition had been born. What began as fragile glass and theory now promised to make the sky itself intelligent and deadly. The proximity fuse's problem was not invention, but survival. How to make fragile electronics endure an artillery round's instant of annihilation. Fired from naval guns or field pieces, a fuse rode a shell that underwent accelerations of 20,000 G, a violence that shattered ordinary tubes and ripped leads apart. Engineers from the U.S. National Defense Research Committee, General Electric, and Johns Hopkins set about ruggedizing components. Vacuum tubes redesigned with heavy ceramic bases, filaments brazed and potted so they would not fracture under setback. Power could not come from external wiring, so designers created reserve batteries that activated after firing, chemical cells or centrifugal contacts that closed as the shell spun, arming the fuse only once it had left the barrel. Within a 2-inch housing sat a tuned oscillator, a tiny amplifier and a detector, miniature versions of radar equipment that had to be shock-proof and spin-resistant. Tests at Dahlgren, Virginia, in early 1942, fired hundreds of instrumented rounds at towed drones. Most failed, but a persistent minority detonated at the correct distance, producing lethal patterns no timed fuse could match. When Merle examined recovered components and telemetry, he recognized a new class of weapon, electronics that could survive gun launch and make autonomous timing decisions. Production moved quickly. British factories adapted the design for 3.7-inch anti-aircraft shells, while U.S. arsenals fitted VT fuses to 5-inch naval rounds on destroyers. The code name VT, short for variable time, disguised the fuse's nature, but inside that abbreviation lay a decisive shift. The shell was no longer dumb ordnance, but a thinking munition. The next trial would be in battle, where these fragile miracles would have to prove they could change the calculus of air defense under actual fire. General Electric and other firms retooled production lines, developing methods to rapidly produce thousands of ruggedized tubes while keeping the program highly secret. December 1942, the seas off the Solomon Islands boiled with heat and oil fumes as the U.S. Navy prepared to repel yet another Japanese air assault. From the carrier Junyo, a wave of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers roared low through broken clouds, sunlight flashing across their wings as they began their runs toward the destroyer screen protecting Guadalcanal's fragile lifeline. On the decks of USS Helena, gunners waited, hands poised over 5-inch breech levers, eyes burning from cordite smoke. They had been issued new shells marked only with the code letters VT. Few knew what that meant. When the Japanese formation broke through, Helena's batteries opened fire. The sky erupted, not in the familiar chain of distant puffs trailing helplessly behind, but in perfect instantaneous bursts beside the attackers. Witnesses saw one bomber sliced apart mid-roll, another lose both wings in a single flash. In less than 4 minutes, 4 aircraft spiraled into the sea, the survivors scattering in disbelief. No one had adjusted the timing. No gunner had guessed the altitude. The fuses had done the thinking themselves. Fleet officers later reported the phenomenon with awe. Post-action analysis showed the ship's anti-aircraft effectiveness had tripled. For the first time in naval history, a fleet possessed a defensive curtain that regulated its own explosions, a living wall of steel and radar energy. The secret was guarded with fanatical discipline. Every recovered fragment of a downed bomber was destroyed to prevent Japanese engineers from discovering the device. Within months, carrier groups and convoys armed with VT shells were suffering far fewer losses, their gunners trusting the invisible intelligence within each round. But the Pacific was only the proving ground. The real storm was still gathering in Europe, where the Luftwaffe's precision formations would soon meet this unseen adversary above the clouds of 1944. By the closing months of 1943, the war in Europe had entered a new rhythm, one of massive preparation. The Allies were gathering strength for an invasion that would break Hitler's fortress from the west, and every airfield, depot and harbour now bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Yet authorization to use the new VT fuse over European soil had been withheld for fear that a single dude might fall into enemy hands. Only when victory began to depend on the survival of beachheads and convoys did the War Department finally relent. In January 1944, crates marked top secret. Variable time fuses arrived in Italy. The British 8th Army's gun crews near Anzio were among the first to receive them. When the German counterattacks began, Junkers Ju-88s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers swept low across the coastal plain, their pilots veterans of the Blitz and confident in their evasion tactics. But as they descended into firing range, the sky itself seemed to rebel. Instead of the familiar pattern of harmless bursts lagging behind their formations, explosions now appeared exactly where they flew, spherical walls of shrapnel that shredded wings and engines in fractions of a second. Soldiers on the beach watched in astonishment as burning aircraft crashed into the surf. One observer wrote that it felt as though invisible hands were swatting planes from the air. Within 2 weeks, Luftwaffe sorties over Anzio dropped by nearly half. German intelligence officers initially suspected sabotage of altimeters or new radar-guided fire control, but interrogated pilots spoke of shells that followed them through the clouds. By summer, as the Allies pushed into France, VT-fused shells had become standard on the American 90mm M1 guns guarding bridges and supply lines. The numbers told the truth. Anti-aircraft fire was now statistically lethal, and the psychological impact was even greater. For the Luftwaffe, confidence in altitude, speed, and timing had vanished. And as 1944 drew toward its cruel winter, London's defenders would soon call on the same miracle fuse to stop a new menace. The pilotless vengeance weapon, the V1 June 1944 brought a new sound to the British night, a mechanical growl that began as a distant hum and built into a rattling roar above the rooftops. The Luftwaffe had unleashed its Vergeltungswaffe I, the vengeance weapon. The V1 flying bomb, a pilotless craft driven by a pulse-jet engine, streaked toward London at over 400 miles per hour and at barely 2,000 feet of altitude. When its engine cut out, a chilling silence followed for a few seconds, then impact, fire, and collapse. In the first week alone, hundreds of V1s struck across southern England, their speed and unpredictability mocking traditional defenses. RSF Spitfire pilots learned to intercept them by tipping their wings mid-flight, a dangerous maneuver that often sent both aircraft tumbling. Anti-aircraft crews along the coast fired until their barrels glowed, but most shells burst harmlessly behind the bombs. Then came the new fuse. By late June, radar-directed 3.7-inch batteries around the Thames estuary were quietly rearmed with the VT variable time fuse. The transformation was instant and astonishing. Instead of bursts scattered in vain arcs, explosions now bloomed directly beside the oncoming missiles, tearing their thin fuselages apart in mid-air. Civilians on the ground described it as if the sky itself had turned predatory, each approaching V1 meeting a sudden white flash before disintegrating. By August, accuracy in key sectors rose from a mere 17% to more than 70%. The percentage of flying bombs reaching central London dropped sharply, and the familiar night of dread gave way slowly to one of endurance and defiance. German engineers who later examined wreckage found no bullet holes or impact marks, only the strange signs of mid-air detonation. They speculated about magnetic fields or new forms of guided flak, unaware that Britain's gunners were now wielding radar intelligence condensed into a fuse no bigger than a matchbox. The same nation, once terrorized by invisible weapons, had turned invisibility into its own defense. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe's intelligence files had begun to fill with strange and desperate reports. Crews returning from raids over Normandy, Antwerp, and southern England described an invisible menace in the sky, shells that seemed to know where they were. They exploded not behind, not below, but beside them, even when pilots dived, banked, or cut speed to throw off gunners. One shaken Ju-88 navigator wrote that it felt as though the English had given thought to their shells. At Luftnachrichtendienst headquarters, analysts pored over the accounts, struggling to fit them into known physics. Some proposed that the Allies had developed micro-radar sets built into the projectiles. Others suspected a magnetic attraction to aircraft engines. Still others imagined photoelectric sensors reacting to sunlight on fuselages or sound-triggered detonators. None of it made sense. In Berlin, research teams at Telefunken and Siemens tried to replicate the effect, assembling crude prototypes using photocells, acoustic diaphragms, and field coils. Every test failed. What the Germans lacked were the tiny, ruggedized vacuum tubes and compact batteries that made the VT fuse viable, technologies whose secrets lay locked within Allied factories, guarded as tightly as atomic research. By autumn, Luftwaffe engineers began to suspect that radar direction itself had been fused to shell bursts, perhaps by real-time control from ground stations. The theory was dismissed by senior officers as fantasy. But confusion persisted. Propaganda officials in Goebbels' ministry refused to mention the new weapon publicly, fearing panic among bomber crews already demoralized by mounting losses. In private, Luftwaffe veterans spoke of flying through walls of self-aware fire, their confidence in aerial mastery eroding with each mission. The proximity fuse had transcended its mechanical form. It had become a legend, a phantom that stalked the German sky. While German scientists argued over theories, Allied factories from Baltimore to Birmingham were producing them by the tens of thousands every week. By mid-1944, the proximity fuse had grown from a laboratory secret into one of the most ambitious industrial undertakings of the war. More than 70 American firms and 13 British contractors were enlisted in its manufacture, forming a continent-wide web of precision and secrecy. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins directed the designs, while companies like RCA, Crosley, Eastman, and Sylvania turned those blueprints into reality, producing miniature vacuum tubes and circuit components at a scale once thought impossible. Every fuse contained more than 100 individual parts, each built to microscopic tolerances. Most of the workers assembling them, many of them young women in factory smocks, were told only that they were building radio devices for aircraft, but they never knew that each unit they soldiered would one day think for itself at 30,000 feet. In Maryland and New Jersey, round-the-clock shifts produced over 2 million fuses per month by the end of 1944. British plants at Farnborough and the Woolwich Arsenal re-engineered the American design for 3.7-inch and naval 4.5-inch shells, adjusting for differences in ammunition and gunnery conditions. Completed fuses traveled across the Atlantic in sealed wooden crates labeled mechanical time devices, each convoy escorted by warships lest a single shipment fall into enemy hands. Reliability reached 80%, astonishing for an electronic weapon exposed to the shock of 20,000 G engineers credited this success to an unprecedented fusion of science and manufacturing discipline. Precision magnetrons, ceramic-based tubes, and centrifugal-activated batteries that armed themselves only after firing. Behind every gunner who sighted a V-1 or Luftwaffe bomber, an invisible army of designers, machinists, and assemblers was fighting a quieter war. As Allied production hit full stride, millions of these matchbox-sized mines rolled off assembly lines, ready for the war's final. Thunderous campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. December 1944. Snow lay thick across the Ardennes, muffling sound, hiding movement, and cloaking the German buildup that would explode into the last great offensive of the war. On the morning of the 16th, the fog was so dense that Allied aircraft were grounded, their engines silenced by weather and disbelief. Out of the mist came panzers and infantry of the German 5th and 6th Panzer Armies, smashing into thin American lines. For days the front buckled. Towns like St. Vith and Bastogne became desperate islands of resistance, surrounded by an enemy fighting with the fury of the cornered. Then, from behind the American lines, a new kind of thunder began to roll. The U.S. Army's 2nd Field Artillery Group had received permission to use the VT, variable time, fuse in a role no one had tested before, against ground troops. Instead of striking the earth, these shells detonated 30 feet above it, spraying deadly fragments over entire platoons. Near Bastogne, the results were beyond comprehension. German infantry advancing through the trees were caught in invisible storms of steel, shredded, before they even saw their targets. Witnesses described curtains of airbursts sweeping the woods, the explosions perfectly spaced, perfectly timed. One artillery officer wrote home, "It was as if the hand of God reached down. For the first time, artillery achieved near-perfect lethality without line of sight and without warning." German survivors spoke of explosions that seemed to fall from nowhere, demoralizing even veteran units. Within weeks, the momentum of the bulge had reversed. General George S. Patton later called the proximity fuse one of the 3 great developments of the war, crediting it with saving thousands of lives and halting the German advance cold. From the skies above Kent to the frozen forests of Belgium, Samuel Curran's tiny circuit had redefined what accuracy meant in modern war. But before the guns fell silent, it would unleash one final demonstration of power, this time over the Pacific. Spring 1945, the Pacific was burning. As Japan's empire shrank to its final islands, the Imperial Navy unleashed its most desperate weapon, the kamikaze. Off Okinawa, hundreds of suicide planes rose each morning from Kyushu, their pilots sworn to crash into American ships at any cost. They came low, fast, and erratic, too quick for traditional gunnery tables, too unpredictable for the old-time fuses that still required judgment and luck. The fleet's survival now depended on one small invention that could think faster than any man. On destroyers like USS Laffey, Cassin Young, and Hadley, gunners loaded 5-inch shells tipped with the VT fuse. As radar picked up incoming bogies, the guns opened in furious rhythm, each shell armed only after clearing the barrel, each one carrying its own invisible radar pulse. The sea erupted in concentric bursts as shells detonated beside their targets, not behind them. Japanese planes that had once powered through flak curtains now disintegrated mid-dive, torn apart before their final scream could reach the decks. The Laffey, attacked by 22 kamikazes in one day, survived, a floating testament to a matchbox-sized miracle. Across the fleet, results bordered on the miraculous. In the Okinawa campaign alone, more than 1,200 attacking aircraft were destroyed by VT-fused fire. Admiral Raymond Spruance called it the single greatest defensive improvement of the war. Crews who once fired blindly now watched their weapons strike with mathematical certainty. Even among kamikaze pilots, morale began to crack. Intercepted diaries described sky mines that seemed to detonate at will, snatching comrades from the air before they could fulfill their final mission. By August 1945, nearly 22 million proximity fuses had been produced, each one a microcosm of science, courage, and precision. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the waves off Okinawa, this tiny circuit had rewritten the rules of warfare. Few who lived through it knew the name Samuel Curran, but his invisible invention had defended 2 continents and helped bring the war to its close. Beyond its technical genius, the proximity fuse reshaped the emotional landscape of war. For the Allied soldier or sailor, it became a symbol of unseen protection, proof that science itself now stood guard. Every round carried with it an invisible ally, a machine that could think in mid-air and deliver vengeance with uncanny precision. To the men under bombardment, this was not merely technology, it was justice rendered through circuitry. In after-action reports, gunners described feeling as though they had gained a new sense, the ability to touch the enemy across distance. The confidence it inspired was profound. Gun crews who once felt helpless watching bombs fall now trusted their weapons implicitly, convinced that each pull of the lanyard bent probability itself in their favor. For the Axis, the same invention became a nightmare. Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine veterans later wrote of explosions that seemed guided by fate rather than aim. It was as if destiny had gone electric, one German pilot recalled. Formation discipline eroded as bomber crews broke ranks, terrified of zones of invisible death. Reports from German airfields spoke of crews refusing missions through flak corridors, citing unexplainable bursts. The psychological toll compounded the physical losses. While British newspapers cautiously celebrated miracle shells, the true mechanism remained classified, leaving the enemy to fight phantoms of their own imagination. In hindsight, the VT fuse marked the beginning of something larger, a fusion of science, fear and faith that transcended the battlefield. It was the first weapon to make perception itself a theater of war. By the time peace returned, commanders understood they had glimpsed a new epoch, one where intelligence would live inside the weapon, and terror would no longer need a visible face. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the proximity fuse remained cloaked in secrecy. Official communique credited improved fire control or advances in ordnance, but the true mechanism was omitted even from victory parades. Few outside military science circles knew that a 2-inch cylinder of electronics had quietly rewritten the laws of warfare. Yet its influence radiated swiftly through the peace that followed. The same principles that allowed a shell to sense and strike became the foundation of radar-guided missiles, surface-to-air rockets, and the first generation of precision munitions. The age of guided weaponry, the electronic battlefield, had begun with a matchbox-sized brain forged in the desperation of 1940. Sir Samuel Curran, the Scottish physicist who had first conceived of that electronic fuse, returned to civilian life with the same meticulous curiosity that had defined his wartime work. He helped establish the University of Strathclyde and later directed Britain's atomic weapons research establishment, applying his gift for miniaturized precision to the new atomic age. Historians now place the VT fuse, alongside radar and the atomic bomb, as one of the 3 defining technological triumphs of World War II. Its essence, autonomous detonation triggered by environmental sensing, was the first real expression of machine decision-making in combat. Post-war German engineers, granted access to captured examples, admitted they could never have produced such devices under wartime conditions. Their industry lacked both the materials and the micro-engineering to make vacuum tubes survive a gun's fury. What began as a desperate attempt to save Britain's skies had blossomed into a doctrine that would shape every weapon system of the Cold War and beyond. Yet its greatest legacy remained human. The moment terrified Luftwaffe crews first realized they were fighting an enemy they could neither see nor outthink. From the smoke-streaked skies above, Kent to the surf-churned waters off Okinawa, a single idea, contained within a circuit scarcely larger than a matchbox, had redrawn the boundaries of war. Sir Samuel Curran's proximity fuse transformed the shell from blind steel into a weapon with perception. For the first time, lifeless metal could sense its target, measure the invisible and strike with its own judgment. It was science made sentient, an intellect forged not in theory, but in the raw urgency of survival. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the unseen precision that tore its formations apart. In the Pacific, kamikaze pilots met a silent adversary that destroyed them mid-dive, an electronic will they could neither outfly nor comprehend. Curran's creation was not celebrated with fanfare or medals. It worked in anonymity, its victories hidden beneath the thunder of larger legends. Yet the proximity fuse became the quiet symbol of a new epoch, one in which warfare would no longer depend on eyesight or chance, but on circuits and decisions made in microseconds. When the world began to rebuild, few remembered the man who had turned the very air into a weapon. But every pilot who lived through the flak, and every soldier spared by its defense, owed something to his invisible genius. The fuse had no face, no anthem, but it won its war in silence, and its pulse still endures, humming faintly within every guided weapon that followed.